Something like this has given me a lot of faith in what people can do when they collectively put their minds to something and believe in each other.
Welcome everyone to Crazy Good Turns. We recognize and celebrate people who do crazy good things for others. I'm your host, Frank Blake, and our guest today is Sean Doherty. Sean is the chairman of the JDRF Type 1 Diabetes Fund, which is a venture philanthropy fund. But of course, that's just a corporate description, and it doesn't begin to describe the time, energy, passion, and creativity that he has applied to addressing type 1 diabetes. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I hope we get into Sean's personal journey on the role of venture philanthropy and many other topics. It's truly an honor to have Sean in the show. So welcome, Sean.
Thank you, Frank, and very nice of you to have me here today.
No, it's a privilege. So I read, Sean, that there are over 1 million people in the United States with type 1 diabetes. And I was wondering if you could start maybe educating our audience a little bit about the disease.
Sure. Yeah, there are about 1.6 million Americans have the disease and 20 million people around the world, surely several million who are developing it right now and don't even know about it. The most important thing to know is people get confused between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. They're actually very different diseases. Type 1 is an autoimmune disease where the body basically just essentially rejects the beta cells that produce insulin, and it strikes suddenly in otherwise healthy people, and it can come really at any age. My son was diagnosed at 2 years old. You hear diagnoses even a little bit earlier than that, and often you hear of diagnoses as late as 50. So an autoimmune disease that has a lot more in common with other gut-based autoimmune diseases really than type 2 diabetes, which is really when the body can't effectively use the insulin that it's making.
What year was your son diagnosed with diabetes?
Our son Finn is 20 years old now. He was diagnosed at 2 years old in 2002.
How is he doing now?
He's doing really well. He's just back from his second year in college. I think like any other kid in college, the number one concern is that this has been a tough year.
Yeah.
Tough year for everybody and college kids in particular. But the technology and care is a lot better than it was 20 years ago. When he was an infant, it's really extraordinary. He's 30 pounds or so. We had to use 3 different kinds of insulin, a long-acting insulin, a medium-acting insulin, and a short-acting insulin. And he was so small that we actually had to dilute the fast-acting insulin with a saline solution, and you're giving shots to this 2-year-old kid for years and years. Wow. It's changed dramatically now. He's on a pump like a lot of people with type 1 diabetes, an insulin pump that is now in the early stages of speaking to the blood glucose monitor that checks his sugar. So it's a lot healthier, but still it's a pretty burdensome disease.
And did you decide early on with your son's diagnosis that you were going to get involved, or was that a gradual thing? How did that occur?
It was pretty immediate. I probably had a pretty different reaction from my wife. Mine was, we got to go do something about this right now, and joined in with JDRF. Hers was probably a lot more sane, which was, this is really hard. It's really hard, and it became an overwhelming, and full-time job for her in particular, and for our family. But I got involved in JDRF right out of the gate. It's kind of a global organization focused in the United States, but a global organization really was formed by parents about 50 years ago to try to improve the lives of people with type 1.
And did you jump both feet in right off, or was it more a gradual, boy, this is interesting, it's important, I got to spend more time on it?
It was pretty gradual. I was kind of a mid-level associate in a law firm then, so I was working all the time. I got involved, volunteered, was asked to join the local board. JDRF has a bunch of chapters all over the country, so it's the local folks are really your fundraisers and community builders. So I started helping with fundraising, but it was pretty modest for sure for many years, for at least the first 5 or 8 years.
And then what flipped the switch? What was the change?
I would say it was even then, Frank, more of a dimmer than a switch. I got more and more involved. I started moving into sort of officer positions to try to help lead fundraising efforts and stuff like that, and eventually became the president of the chapter and, tried to help build the the local organization into something that was a little bigger and a little more robust, and we raised a lot more money, which was nice. But sort of get sucked into something like that and realize that you really are doing a lot of good. I will say, speaking of crazy good turns, I think the kind of things that my wife has worked on have even been really more impactful family by family. This is a really, really life-changing diagnosis for families, particularly when there are young children involved. The number of moms that she has mentored over the years has been really terrific. When a mom has a new diagnosis, they end up finding out my wife's name, and they spend a lot of time together. The moms actually tend to know this disease even better than the nurses sometimes.
I bet. Now, at some point, you leave the law firm and go to Bain Capital, which is one of the preeminent private equity firms in the country, and then you leave Bain Capital and do this venture philanthropy fund. Is that also a gradual move, or was there some precipitating event?
The dimmer switch turned into a much stronger switch in 2015. I was still at Bain Capital at the time, but a guy by the name of John Brady, who was also a volunteer to JDRF, he was the international chairman of it, in 2015 invited my wife and me out to dinner in Boston, and I thought we were just going to get asked for a bunch of money or something, and instead what he asked me was, would I be interested in putting together a business plan for kind of a venture arm of JDRF. JDRF is one of the world's leading funders of research into type 1 diabetes, but it had made a couple of efforts at trying to fill the so-called valley of death and to try to make sure that some of this research was actually turning into commercial opportunities. So I said sure, and it was one of those interesting moments that I've thought of many times. I remember waking up the next morning after this dinner, and it's one of those days you kind of remember the weather and just thinking, gosh, I gotta go do this. This sounds really, really cool. It just hit me at just the right time. It seemed like it was maybe a way that I could use some of what I knew how to do. And so I said I would take it on, and there was another guy at Bain Capital named Colin Motley, who was a private equity investor, has type 1 diabetes himself. He happened to be on leave from Bain Capital. He was at Harvard Business School as a second year, so had some time to help there. And together we sort of put together an effort and started by just doing a whole lot of diligence about what was actually going on. And it sort of blew me away.
Going on in the world of research on diabetes, going on
right.
in venture philanthropy generally.
Well, not venture philanthropy, but what was going on in investing in type 1.
Right.
And the answer was not a lot when it came to curing it. And so in the course of this, you sort of learn very much about the life sciences and healthcare ecosystem, which I find fascinating because there are so many different pieces have to come together from government and academia, philanthropy on one end of the spectrum, big industry like pharmaceutical companies, but also insurance payers and regulators. And in the middle is this really important but relatively small life sciences venture capital industry, which plays this essential role because the pharmaceutical companies will be naturally risk averse. There are thousands of diseases, tens of thousands of opportunities, and they essentially need a proving ground. What we witnessed in the fall of 15 as we were researching this is there was actually a little bit of fog. We had a great philanthropy in JDRF and also the Helmsley Charitable Trust. Really good government support, particularly from the US government, the UK government, Canadian government, and pretty strong academic medical centers. So all those pieces were there for great T1D research. On the other end of the spectrum, there was pretty good pharmaceutical support and insurance support in the insulin manufacturers, the pump manufacturers, the investment in better blood sugar monitors that were smaller, more accurate. They were leading better health outcomes. So it seemed like, it looks like all of this is sort of working. But if you dig down, the largest cure-oriented type 1 diabetes investment round when we were looking at this in 2015 was a $44 million Series A round in a company called Sema Therapeutics, which has since gone on to be very successful, bought by Vertex. But that was all. And so type 1 diabetes relies on a standard of care that's literally 100 years old, which is...
So it was more treatment-oriented spend, not curative spend.
Exactly. And so we started to get behind, well, why is that? And there were really kind of three prevailing myths. The first one was, among really smart people, a lot of confusion between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Just a misunderstanding about it. And you hear it gets shortened all the time in the press as diabetes. And there are a lot of drugs that help people with diabetes. When you hear that in the press, that's actually type 2. And just sort of a lot of confusion about it. The second myth is a legacy of what the disease used to be called. It was always referred to as juvenile diabetes. So you'd have juvenile diabetes and adult onset diabetes. Well, that was actually the wrong categorization. There are kids, unfortunately, who get type 2 diabetes, who suffer from obesity and a lack of activity and may develop type 2 as a child. And there certainly are adults who get autoimmune diabetes or type 1. But there was a lot of confusion in that. If you're a venture capitalist, you hear juvenile and you think harder, more expensive, more difficult to get improved. Even look at how the COVID vaccine is advancing. The kids will be last because of safety concerns and expense around that. So you just sort of write it off pretty quickly. And then the third myth was that insulin was a cure, that the standard of care that had been developed was basically fine now. When in fact, for all sorts of reasons, that isn't the case. And so what we sort of thought was, and we meaning this is a group of volunteers. One of the cool things about the T1D Fund, it really was formed by a small group of like-minded volunteers, many of whom are still on our board today. We looked at that and sort of said, if we don't do something about this, there's literally no one who is going to. One of the strengths that we had when we were building this thing is that JDRF did have such a dominant share of the T1D philanthropic market. If you take the Helmsley Charitable Trust out of New York plus JDRF, that's the lion's share of non-governmental funding for type 1 diabetes research in the world. And so that's a strength that I'll get to in a moment about like how we were able to kind of build this thing. But it also was a pretty big obligation because you could literally say, if we don't do this, no one is going to do it. And so we realized it was time.
And did you start by, all right, we're going to also, in addition to seeing the need in type 1 diabetes, also understand how venture philanthropy works? What are the successes? What does that look like? Or did you go, nah, we can pretty much, this is going to be our own thing?
Probably a little more of the latter. I get asked by a lot of disease foundations now about forming their own vehicle. And I think a lot of philanthropies look at this and they see this as a really great way to raise money because it sounds really interesting. And people that are investors in their day jobs or CEOs that might have the resources to do it, this is sort of interesting. And it has proven to be a really great way to raise money. We're coming up on having raised $100 million of donor capital into this. But my advice to them all the time is never think about this as a fundraising vehicle. Think very specifically about what we're trying to do. And so the answer to your question is yes, we looked at a few models. There really aren't very many. The CF Foundation comes to mind with the amazing things that they did. That was a little bit of a different model. They took a lot of the assets of the foundation itself and put it into to a company that ended up getting bought, coincidentally, also by Vertex, and has yielded a lot of money for CF. That's sort of the gold standard. Ours was different to say, well, what if we set up a fund with the laser focus of creating a venture market in type 1 diabetes on the core premise that this is a billions of dollar problem, not a tens of millions of dollar problem. And if we're the world's leader in type 1 diabetes, we have to adjust our business model to accept that core reality. Philanthropy cannot come up with billions of dollars. JDRF or any philanthropy for that matter cannot cure disease. But I think that this disease doesn't get cured without JDRF. And so how do we square that? How do we maybe create a vehicle that can take advantage of the incredible asset that we have, which is a knowledge and network base? We tell the venture capital firms that invest alongside us and the companies we invest in that without any exaggeration, we're 1, 2, or 3 phone calls away from anyone on the planet that knows something of significance in type 1 diabetes. And so think about the fact there's no market in this at the time. We're trying to convince people that hadn't invested in this before to do it. They want to figure out a way to de-risk it. They want to look at an opportunity and say, gosh, by co-investing alongside the T1D fund, we get access to that kind of diligence. And once we've invested in the company alongside them, we have ready access to clinician network, scientific network, payer network, patient advocacy resources, everything like that, that will help make this company more successful. And so that was the model that we went at. It's like, what if I've always thought of this as an impact investing fund. It's just that our method of capital formation is tailored to the impact we're trying to have. We needed to raise the money philanthropically because the thing that we were bringing, our value add, was reliance on a philanthropic asset. We couldn't raise this as a for-profit fund because the reason our dollar was valuable to others was this big philanthropic resource that stood behind us. And we were able to convince, now 90 families have donated to us, every single one of them directly affected by this disease, which is a badge of honor for us. It started as a fundraising tactic, but now I like it. I like that 90 families with this disease got together and said, let's go really disrupt things.
For the greater good for everyone who's dealing with it. So let me ask you, this is, I watched a video where you received an award from JDRF for, what you've been doing. And you started, it was a great talk, by the way. I might ask you at the end how people can find a link to it. I know I can't even remember how I found the link to it, but I did. But you started the talk by saying, I guess it was to this person, John Brady, but you thanked one of your colleagues for talking you off the ledge several times.
It probably was John. I can't remember that specifically, but John.
So what was the ledge in doing something like this, and what talked you off it?
I wish I could remember the exact context, but it's starting something like this surely wasn't without its challenges. We were forming something that, well, first of all, it didn't exist, but it had to be a part of this big legacy organization, but not fully integrated into it because it was a different animal. When we were starting this, I was worried, is anyone ever going to give this any money? Is anyone going to come work for this? Which was one of the main things I was worried about. I figure if you can get the right people to come work for it, it's going to be easier to raise money. How do we get true life sciences venture investors? And life sciences VCs are a different breed from most VCs in the sense that the overwhelming majority of them have a scientific PhD or a medical degree. And then they've made themselves into investors, but they had to have that kind of scientific background. So it's pretty niche-y. Are we going to be able to attract them into this concept of venture capital without the opportunity for big upside? Which obviously drives a lot of venture capitalists. And you're going to get a share of the profits. We can't give a share of the profits to our staff because this is a philanthropic model. Are we going to be able to attract anyone to come to it? And then what if we do both of those things? We raise money and we get a team to come work for it, and the market just isn't there, and the VCs don't want to invest alongside us, and so.
All right, that's a pretty good ledge.
There was a series of ledges, and then
that's a pretty scary ledge. What talks you off it?
Yeah, well, John was always just a very steady presence for me, and as you think about crazy good turns, I think giving me the kind of the challenge and the opportunity to do something like this, it was life-changing. And being somebody that was always there ready to talk to me about a particular challenge, particularly because it's a little bit of a tear out of a broader organization. We're run separately. The fund is a wholly owned sub, but it's governed by its own board that tends to have investors on it, has its own investment committee. There's a revolutionary concept within a disease foundation that you weren't going to go through the normal grant-making protocols that in most disease philanthropies can take 6, 9, 12 months because there's pretty established best practices in how one does that. That can't work that way in a venture fund. It's time to make an investment, and we had to set it up that way. So there were a lot of challenges in getting it structured, and that wouldn't have happened without him.
So I imagine, but you correct me, if as you go down this path and now decide to do it full time, that there has to be a lot of both discomfort and then some compensating inspiration. We've talked some about the discomfort. Where are the sources of the inspiration? How do you tackle something this huge and say, yes, this is progress. This I can see we're making a difference?
we can look at sort of some objective measurements. I said a little bit earlier that the biggest round in the space when we started this was a $44 million round. In the last 4.5 years, over $500 million of venture capital money has gone into type 1 diabetes. We have investments in 25 companies. About 20 of those are cure-oriented. And to cure type 1, you have to have an immune therapy, and you have to have a so-called beta cell therapy that's going to make the beta cells either make new beta cells or make the beta cells work again. The really great and inspirational thing about it was how a group of parents and grandparents stared each other in the face and said, should we go for this? And we did it. And to not just get it off the launch pad, but to continue to refine and make this model better and better and better. That kind of partnership that was founded on all of us having made a promise basically to our kids and our grandkids, or kids or grandkids, either explicitly or sort of implicitly, the way parents and grandparents do, that we're going to do everything we possibly can to change the answer here. I think it's particularly acute. This is true of any disease, so I won't try to compare it, but I'll just speak for what I witnessed in type 1 diabetes. This is a maintenance disease, meaning your body literally doesn't make any insulin. And so the number of things that you do every single day, even the two of us now, with the amount we're focusing on this conversation, that leads to changes in your blood sugar that our bodies are producing insulin to counteract, to keep your blood sugar to a steady level. There's a difference in kids in their blood sugar between going to a lacrosse practice, which will tend to drive down blood sugar, versus a lacrosse game, which counteracts with a lot of adrenaline, and so the insulin needs are different. People with type 1 diabetes think about type 1 diabetes all of the time, in everything that they do. My son said to me about 6 months ago, some of the new technology, actually the blood glucose sensors speak to the pump. It's called a closed loop, where some of the decision making is now happening automatically instead of having to think about how many units of insulin you need to counteract to where your blood sugar is. He said something to me that he just said sort of matter-of-factly, two things actually. One was describing an entire morning that he didn't think about type 1.
Wow. Oh, wow.
It's sad, right? I mean, he's had this disease for 18 years, and to describe it that way. The other thing that he said to me about this now closed-loop technology, which, by the way, JDRF and its CEO, Aaron Kowalski, were so important in driving this and getting companies to adopt it and convincing the FDA that it was safe. Overnight control is really difficult because a lot of the foods you eat in the evenings metabolize differently and have different spikes at different times of night. One of the great benefits of this technology is you can sort of pick the level that you want to be at, the blood sugar level, and the two devices working in tandem will keep it almost exactly at that level overnight when they're working well. He said to me, he goes, "Dad, you would have no way of really understanding this, but how much different your morning and your day feels when you wake up every morning with a blood sugar of 110 versus a blood sugar of whatever. That my day is different when I wake up with a blood sugar of 110 instead of a blood sugar of 270 or something." I guess just to go back to your original question, all of us on our board and a broader group of volunteers and these 90 families are bound by this, that we watch someone in our lives. In some cases, the people involved themselves have it, but most of it's watching people we love very much not complain about it and put in this effort every single minute of every single day to keep themselves healthy. And so I think it's been really inspirational to me to see what a group of parents and grandparents can just decide to do to change the answer, almost out of recognition of all of their efforts. They don't get to take a day off of type 1, and so it sort of, I think, pushes all of us, and certainly pushed me.
So if the Sean Doherty of today goes back 6 years and talks to yourself of 6 years ago, what does he say to him?
I think take chances like this. Look for opportunity in how you can make the lives of others better, and it is equally or even more exciting for the person doing that kind of thing, even than the people that you're helping. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just, I'm so glad that when I woke up that morning, I thought this is something I have to try. Something like this has given me a lot of faith in what people can do when they collectively put their minds to something and believe in each other. And this is just such a strange time in our country, and to have something like this in my life, I think, has been a real blessing. To every once in a while just pinch yourself, say, gosh, all the things that we thought could happen are actually happening. I mean, venture capital firms are, when they hear about a potential type 1 opportunity, because of this terrific staff that we've hired and their reputation, they get phone calls from these name brand life sciences VC firms saying things like, well, we're interested in it, but we wouldn't want to make this investment unless the T1D fund invested alongside us. We're not there yet. Even being invited to do something like this, there's sort of this implication that this is a great accomplishment. This is early innings. We've set a foundation for something that's catalyzed a market, but we're still too many years away from curing this. I think the best and most important days of the T1D fund are ahead of it, actually. What we've done so far is really just get it off the launch pad and get it into orbit. But there's a lot of work to do yet. And I think we built a good foundation, but the work really lies ahead, actually.
Where will you be 5 to 10 years from now? So if you let yourself be really optimistic, where will you be 5 to 10 years from now?
I wish I had an answer to that one, Frank. It's a question I find myself sitting on a chaise lounge staring at the ceiling asking all the time. I'm awfully devoted to this cause. It's fun to see a place where one can make an impact. I think that the T1D fund will have been involved in some of the most important things to ever happen in this disease. I started to say this, to try this phrase out about 6 months ago, but now I really believe in it. I think the T1D fund has transformed the fight to cure type 1 diabetes. And so now we have to see just how good it can be. When some of our companies have been sold or gone public, and so we're actually able to sell that stock, it recycles into the fund, and the fund just becomes sort of self-perpetuating. But what's interesting about life sciences is the money comes first. The pharmaceutical companies are looking at the huge landscape, but they don't want to wait too long to miss out on an opportunity. And so a lot of smaller companies get bought, when they're in sort of phase 1 or phase 2 trials, really early, at the time these drugs are just being looked at for safety and efficacy. And so some of our donors are like, well, that's great that there's all this return and everything, but what about the cure? And getting across to people that is going to take more time, and the importance of the T1D fund to guide this, because I don't want people to start doing lousy T1D deals. A few big blow-ups in the industry, and all of a sudden you're going to set yourself back a little bit. So now I think we've gone from sort of catalyzing market, which is objectively happening, to accelerating market, which also I think is objectively happening, to almost guiding the market. And we're starting to see that happen too when these firms call us up and ask us what we think about it. 30 venture capital firms have invested alongside us in 4.5 years. 2/3 of them had never done anything in type 1 before, treatment or cure.
Wow, congratulations. That's amazing. That's terrific. So you may have answered this earlier with your comment about John Brady, but who is someone who's done a crazy good turn for you?
John's surely one of them. The other person that comes to mind is the person that hired me into Bain Capital. It's a guy by the name of Mike Goss. I was still a young lawyer at a law firm in Boston. I was 36 years old, and he picked me out of a crowd almost and made me the first general counsel at Bain Capital, which itself, in retrospect, was a real building opportunity. He encouraged me to experiment, to do a lot of stuff. He gave me a lot of rope and just believed in me. And I think that's a pretty important thing when someone just sort of picks you out of a crowd almost and says that, I don't know, I think this person has what it takes to do something different and trust that person. So I'd probably look at the two of them, and what they actually have something in common, right? Which was creating an opportunity and
well, also seeing something in you,
but then also having the confidence themselves to let me go run with it. And I think a lot of people can identify talent. It's a subset of those people that can also say, let's let the person go. And I think each of, now that I'm thinking about it here. I think each of them did that.
I give, great guests always opportunities to identify if there's a book or something you read that has been interesting to you or builds an insight for you in terms of generosity, philanthropy. I haven't given you a heads up on this, so it's okay if you take a pass and we can move on to other things. But is there any such a book?
The one that comes to mind is Our Towns by Jim Fowles and his wife. It was the Atlantic writer. It's a terrific book about, it's not really about philanthropy, so to speak, but it is about a bunch of communities around the country, small cities and big towns that have faced different challenges and have figured out how to make where they live and their culture better. And the commonality with all of them is public and private partnerships working together. It's sort of a common goal, and each one of them is a little different. A couple of them are failure stories, but most of them are success stories. And I recommend that book to anybody.
Oh, great. I've never heard that book, so I want to read it. And it actually connects back to your comment about all of the people who've been impacted by the disease being your investors. And that sense of such a strong community purpose must be both really energizing, but I mean, do you occasionally feel the weight of that in your job?
Yes, but I find it to be kind of a virtuous cycle. There's certainly elements of every kind of role. Philanthropy has its own that are just hard after a while, in part asking people for money all the time or things like that. And you pause for a second and then you realize that the donors and the patients and everyone in this community, I think, are really hopeful about what we're doing. And you realize that there's just no way that you can let off the gas. When you say, all right, I'm getting back in the car and hitting the gas again, you realize that it makes everybody pretty thrilled. I think it's exciting to see young PhDs who have come to work with us as associates who get really energized by hearing the stories of people with this disease and what this is meaning to them. So I guess I feel the weight of it sometimes, but honestly, and maybe it's just my personality, that weight is pretty energizing.
That's phenomenal. What you're doing is fantastic. It's really exciting. I guess until you see it through a loved one's eyes, it's not obvious what a weight this disease has on the people who have it. So God bless you for taking this on.
I hope that will make a big difference, and I hope that someday this disease will be cured. I think that the first thing will happen is no one should get this disease anymore. It's another thing to reverse it. I think that's going to be longer and harder, but no one should get this anymore. We've figured out a way to stop autoimmune disease, and that's increased over the last decade. Type 1 is harder because it doesn't really give you any warning signs before it's too late. And so somehow we got to figure that one out, and I think we will.
So if listeners are interested in learning either more about the disease or learning more about yourself, where should they go? What are the best places to find information?
Our website is t1dfund.org, and that has a lot of resources on it that'll connect you through to all sorts of things and videos, and the fund is also on LinkedIn. It's JDRF T1D Fund. And
about yourself, or they'll get to you through that?
Well, I guess they'd get to me through that, but I honestly, I'm not the attraction. This is the thing that makes this so great is that a community came together to do something disruptive that has actually worked.
That's a perfect place to end. Thank you, Sean. Thanks for everything you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you also for listening and for being part of the effort to celebrate and recognize people who do amazing things for others. I want to take this time to thank our production team, Stephen Key, Jordan Bornstein, and Megan Hanlon, as well as Score. They do a great job producing these podcasts. And I look forward to bringing you our next episode. And until then, this is Frank Blake, thanking you all very much.